17 miles or 27 kilometers long and 9 miles or 15 kilometers wide. So it is a tiny place. The other islands, as I said, in the archipelago are Gozo, which of course is smaller still, and Comino. And of course you can see there's another one right beside it. There are several smaller ones, but it is a tiny place situated in the middle of the Mediterranean. And of course the modern day capital of Malta is Valletta, but that's a relatively modern city compared to biblical times. In fact, in ancient times, the capital of Malta was situated near the cities of Mdina and Rabat. In fact, Rabat was the location of the Roman capital of Malta by the time of the 1st century AD. And so the capital has changed. And so the main city in the north is Victoria. Of course, you can tell at one stage Malta was ruled over by the British, given away by some of the place names you see. But like I said, it has a rich history, even though it is just a small archipelago situated slap bang in the middle of the Mediterranean. So when you go there, what is Malta like? Well, Malta really, it's of course has a Mediterranean climate. The southern part of the island, so as you can see here, around where the airport is, and just to the southwest of Valletta, it's mostly a plain. But the further north you go, it gets hilly. And so where I was staying is up here in the north, and it's hilly, and so it's not a plain. And this is just close by to where I was. And so you can see here the hills. They're not really massive or steep, but you can see here, this is one of the valleys that's close by to the St. Paul's Bay. And you can see actually some of the rock that the island is formed of. This is basically a form of globular limestone. So it's limestone, but you notice it has lots of holes in it. Someone said it's just like the Burren here in Ireland. And so you can see, of course, very clearly a Mediterranean landscape and a very Mediterranean climate. There's not a lot of big trees. The trees there are more like big bushes compared to what we have over here. Now, of course, Malta at this time when I was there was very dry, very hot. I think on average, hottest it got when I was there was 29 degrees Celsius compared to here. But, you know, it gives you an impression, and we're going to see some more pictures of what the place is like. Because oftentimes, you know, we read about these places in the Bible and we just assume, or we have in our minds, this is what they're like. What is the rest of the island like? So this is looking from top of the walls of the fortress town of Mdina. And so Valletta is off to the east. Further north you go up. So you can see here's the plain of southern part of Malta. You can see the hills off in the distance. And in fact, where I was staying, you could nearly see some of the tops of, well, relatively compared to other places, small skyscrapers in Valletta and so forth. So you can see it is a very fertile place. In the 1st century, it was known for its olive production and for the production of cotton and other things. This is the bay and the harbour of Valletta. Now, of course, the eastern part of the island of Malta has several large bays, which in modern times and in ancient times as well were used for sanctuary for ships, especially during the 1st century. Alexandrian grain ships would stop off here and winter here. And of course, that's what we see in the Bible when Paul was shipwrecked in Malta. What happened? He stayed there for 3 months. And then when the sailing season came about in about April, so April up until about October, that's when ships sailed. Now, you could sail in other times of the year, but you were risking your life doing that. And you only sailed if you desperately had to sail. Otherwise, you didn't. And so here is the famous harbour of Valletta. And there's, of course, there were 3 smaller cities over on the other side of the bay. This is Valletta itself. You can see some of the fortifications from much later of the capital of Valletta. And so this, you could say, could be one of the candidates where Paul was shipwrecked, though it's more likely, as we're going to see, a place further to the north. This is on the island of Gozo. What we see here is this is, of course, gives you an impression. You can see the blue ocean, you can see the cliffs, you can see the hills, you can see the beach. But, you know, just to give you an idea of the place, we move on. as we're going to see, this is an important prehistoric site, which we're going to deal with here in a few moments. This is on the island of Gozo. And so you can see these are small places, like, you know, you can walk from one end to another in a day easy. I could do it anyway, you know, it wouldn't be long. It wouldn't take you too much, a day at least. It's a very small place. As we're going to see, Malta has a very rich prehistory, which it's most famous for. But the history of Malta. So the history of the island during the biblical era, ending in the 1st century AD, can be divided into 3 main divisions. Now, these are official man-made divisions, but it's a handy way to teach through this. Firstly, there's the prehistoric period of Malta, so anything prior to about the 7th century BC. Then you have the Phoenician or Punic period, or the Phoenician and Carthaginian period, 7th century roundabout to 218 BC. And then the Roman period onwards, of course, as we're ending in about the 1st century AD, that would last from 218 BC to the end of the 1st century. Now, like I said, after the 1st century, there's still a rich history in Malta. So it has a rich history, but of course that doesn't all deal with the biblical times. That's much later. Now, the prehistoric period of Malta. Now, archaeologically, the thing that Malta is most famous for is its many unique prehistoric sites and artifacts. You know, you talk about prehistoric sites, you know, people say something like Stonehenge. Well, yeah, that's true. But one of the more famous places, at least for prehistoric archaeology, is Malta. In fact, there are several large megalithic structures that are dotted across both Malta and Gozo that are numbered amongst the oldest man-made structures on Earth, though the peoples and cultures that built them are still very mysterious and unknown. Why? Because all we have is their physical remains of what they did. So their tools, the ruins of their temples, their statues. We don't have any written history. That's why we call it the prehistoric period of Malta, because there's no written history that we know of, as far as we are aware. So that's what prehistory means, before we have written records for the history of the island. So, of course, it did have a history. It did have people living there who were doing things, but we don't know anything about it because, as far as we know, it was never written down. Or if it was, the written language is gone, or we know nothing about it. So that's why we call it prehistoric. Now, for instance, you see here's an example of one of these prehistoric altars in the museum in Valletta. Now, you go to temples in Malta and Gozo, and you see they're constantly, they have these little holes in nearly every surface. And the thing is, on this altar, you may say, well, why did they do that? Don't know. Why did they put little holes in everything? And it's deliberate. It's not just something that took place naturally. They did this for a reason. Why did they put little holes in everything? Don't know. It could have been just as mundane as they liked it, or it could represent something. And that's the problem with prehistoric monuments and artifacts, because there's no written record about what they were used for or why they did certain things. We can only guess. We can only try to interpret based on the available evidence. So remember, archaeology, a lot of it is based upon interpretation. Why did they do that? We don't know. Why are there little holes? Don't know. Simple thing is that. You think, oh, do we not have the answers? Well, no. Because unfortunately, you can find a dead body, but you can't speak to the corpse and say, please tell us why you did this. Oh, it can't tell us. So, for instance, you go to the museum in Valletta and you see its prehistoric part of the museum, and you see lots of these. For instance, and there's a lot more to see too. I'm only just showing you some of the highlights. You see that apparently the people of Malta in its prehistoric period were obsessed with what appeared to be very large, you could say obese people. Now, this shows you how much this is up for interpretation. People say, well, are some of these statues men or are they women? But the fact is, sometimes we don't actually know. There are barring a few exceptions. For instance, they say, oh, that statue here has wide hips. That has to be a woman. Yeah, but notice they don't have large breasts. What's that mean? We don't know. Could it just be a large man? Why would they do that? Why were they making big statues like this? And literally this one here, it's unfortunate I haven't got something to put it to scale, but these are massive. These are really large. This would be probably about as large as this room at full height. Is it a man? Is it a woman? Don't know. Why is it so large? Could it represent fertility? Well, of course it could. Could it mean something else? Of course it could. We just do not know. But there's obviously at least some degree of interest in depicting these statues in such a manner. Though apparently at some point they were destroyed, apparently. Why? Well, maybe the people of the island got upset with their gods or goddesses or whatever they were and said, no, you failed us, so get rid of them. We'll get some new ones in. But for instance here, this is, if you study prehistoric period, this is known as the sleeping lady. Why? Well, because it's a very large sleeping lady on the bed. And that's it. And, this is just to show you some of this. We know, of course, that's a lady for obvious reasons, but these other statues, we don't. Is it a man? Is it a woman? Is it a god? Is it a god? We don't know. For instance, down here you see, and this is very small. This is only about that size. It's like a little tiny image of what appears to be maybe a house or a temple. Why did they do it? Don't know. Why did they make this statue of a sleeping lady? Does it just represent someone who's asleep? Does it represent someone who has died? Don't know. But even that, from a prehistoric period, you can tell it's pretty well made with limited tools. Apparently not even any use of metals. And they made monumental structures with apparently no metal and probably very little in the way of wood. In fact, they found these little stone balls that apparently they may have chipped out to help transport some of these stones. So they say, well, this is a prehistoric society, yeah, but they were pretty smart. Why did they do what they did? We don't always know. So we just move on here. Now, we saw this picture earlier, but this is probably the most famous and the largest of the prehistoric temple structures in the island of Malta. In fact, it's on Gozo, and the name of it is the Gigantica Temples. Now, Maltese is a very funny language. Even our tour guide said that. It said it's a mix of many different languages. It's heavily influenced by Arabic because the Arabs controlled the island for a few centuries till they were driven out. But it uses a Latin alphabet. So it's got a mix of different influences. And our tour guide very clearly said it's not easy to learn. And most people don't bother learning it because it's only spoken on these islands. And most people in the islands speak English anyway. English is mandatory because, well, you have to. Otherwise, if you only spoke Maltese, and, well, no one else would understand what you're saying. You know what I mean? So it's a very hard language. So pardon my pronunciation if I'm wrong. I already do struggle with some of these names and pronunciation. But this is a famous temple, and you can see here, even just the scale of it. Notice that couple there, just close by to it. This was built by one of these prehistoric cultures. You can see the size of the stone. They moved this by hand without cranes. Now, it's actually two temple structures that were surrounded by an encasement wall. This is a model of the temple. So you can see there's one smaller one here to the right. Now, I can't show you all the pictures because, it's hard to, show these things. But what we see here is there's a little temple on the right. There's an outer enclosure wall. And to the left, there's a bigger temple. So they're very similar. And you can see that there is a consistent development of temple structures on the islands during the prehistoric period. Now, what were some of these alcoves or rooms for? We don't entirely know. Sometimes you just have to put your hands up and say, well, it appears to be a temple. It's sort of structured like temples. For what? For who? Don't know. But just gives you an idea. There are several other famous prehistoric structures on the island, but this is by far the largest. Now, this is just looking from the front of it. So, you know, you saw that's the model there. So there's the smaller temple there. The larger one is to the side. There's nearly always the mandatory scaffolding on some ancient sites. So always ruins the view. But hey, you know, it's been there a few thousand years and, you know, it needs to be kept up. So you see here, in fact, you can see some of the size of some of these megalithic building material. These are massive. And these were put up there by hand. How did they do it? Beats me, I don't know. But they did. And in fact, here's just inside. You go in and you can see, of course, there's modern graffiti written on it, you know. But you go in. Actually, it's not modern graffiti. It's old graffiti. But you go in. This is, I think, if I remember, on the right temple. You go in. So you have one bit off to the side, another bit goes to the front, another bit, another bit. Here's, for instance, one of the little side chambers. What was it used for exactly? We don't have a clue. You know, we can guess. And, you know, to be honest, prehistory is not my area of interest. But a lot of these things we don't know. Why they were built in the way they were. What exact purposes did some of these rooms have? Why did they have little dots everywhere? Don't know. So if we can't explain what the little dots are for, you know, maybe you should be careful of saying that we have all the answers. But anyway, but here is one of the more weird structures on the island. It's called the Clapham Junction. And you say, why is it called Clapham Junction? Well, because this is the name that was given to these tracks that are in the limestone when the British were there. Now, Clapham Junction, well, Clapham Junction, what's that? Well, this is Clapham Railway Junction in London. So you notice the railway, they saw this and they thought, oh, that reminds me of Clapham Junction. So that's why it's stuck. Now, the thing is, you see these tracks, they are in the limestone. Obviously, they were put there for some reason, apparently to move stuff across the island. And most archaeologists would probably prefer to say that they were dated to the prehistoric period. But what was their exact purpose? Don't know. Some people say it may have been from later, maybe from the Phoenician period. We don't know. But there's a lot about prehistory that we just simply do not know. In fact, here's another one a bit closer up. This is just by itself, close to where I was staying. In fact, over to your left, there's a World War II bunker. Below the World War II bunker, there's a Roman bath. There's a fortress on the top there. It's like there's very few places in the world you can turn around and see a few millennia of history by just going like that. Oh, literally. So we don't know. Now, I only talk about the prehistory because ultimately that is during the time of the events of the Old Testament. So I believe it took place after the flood. So there were people living on this island, I believe, soon after the flood of Noah. And they were doing things that to us are pretty mysterious, but they did it. So let's go on to a more solid ground as in our understanding. The Phoenician or Punic period of Malta. Now, the written history of Malta begins with the colonization of the islands by the seafaring trading people from the Levant, known today as the Phoenicians, in the 7th century BC. Of course, we've spoken about the Phoenicians in other lessons, so I'm not going to go into it in too much depth, but they came from the land of, which was known as Phoenicia, or modern-day Lebanon, where famous cities of Tyre and Zidon and Byblos were. In fact, the Phoenicians, that's their Greek name, which means along the lines of the purple people, because they were so famous for producing purple dye from the murex mollusk, little sea shell, snail that they used to make purple. And so they were a Canaanite group. They were Canaanites. The Phoenicians were Canaanites. In fact, it's probably believed that they called themselves Canaanites. Or, more particularly, they would have said they were Zidonians or from Byblos. You know, we thought they would have understood their lineage, but really at the end of the day, they were not a single nation or country per se, but a group of smaller independent states that loosely had a confederation one with another. And so writing was introduced by the Phoenicians onto the island, as far as we know, in about the 7th century BC, when the Phoenicians came. They introduced writing to the island along with other skills like metallurgy, in other words, the working of metal. Now you can see here in the museum in Valletta, you can see here is gold from the period of Phoenician inhabitation of the island. Now, we don't know how exactly it came about. Did they go in and conquer the island? Well, that's possible. But they also could have just come, and the people of the island were like, oh, you have cool stuff we like, and we can learn things from you. And so they would integrate. You know, not all colonization was necessarily aggressive. You have things I like, and vice versa. So there was probably a mixing of this. And so what we see here is some of the gold that was created, but also here we see a very early example of writing on Malta with the Phoenician alphabet. And so you can see the alphabet, an early form of the alphabet. Now, the Phoenicians influenced the Greeks, who influenced the Romans, who actually influenced the Etruscans before that, with the alphabet. Why did they do that? How did they do that? Well, because the Phoenicians were trading all across the Mediterranean. And so when the Greeks saw, oh, that alphabet thing's pretty useful, we'll use that, but they changed it. And when those who were living in Italy saw it, they thought, oh, that's useful, but we'll change it. It all comes from their contact with the Phoenicians. But on this stele, this is what it says. The stele of a sacrifice of a lamb, which Arish set up to Baal, come on, the Lord, because he heard the voice of his words. So we see here, now the thing is, the word for sacrifice there can also be used for child sacrifice. But apparently this is referring to a lamb. So it was probably had the idea of a sacrifice that was intended to be a child, but they had a substitute, a lamb. So as far as we know, the Phoenicians did practice child sacrifice, though it's a very heated debate on that, because of course the idea of sacrificing children is a very hot topic, but apparently to some degree or another they did. But here, this is one of the earliest examples of writing on the island. So this is where its written history starts to begin. Here's, of course, a map of where the Phoenicians came from. So here you see the land of Phoenicia in what is roughly the modern-day land of Lebanon. You see Tyre and Byblos and Zidon. Of course, the Phoenicians spread out all across the Western Mediterranean. They founded what we're going to see as Carthage, but they also inhabited Malta and other places all across the North African coast. They also did cohabit with other nations and peoples who were already there in southern Spain. And in fact, the Phoenicians apparently even sailed down the west coast of Africa and traded with the people living in West Africa. And in fact, they apparently went even as far up to the British Isles, because they found tin that originates from the British Isles, from Cornwall. So they got very far. But Malta, of course, is our focus here. So all the way from the Eastern Mediterranean to Central Mediterranean. So, you know, just if you don't know where Malta is, there it is. Sicily, then Tunisia, and of course, Libya, Malta. Here's a coffin, of course, shaped in the form of a person. This is a Phoenician coffin. So, of course, you can see his face and his toes. But in fact, when they made this, you notice here this little indentation. Well, you don't want anyone getting into your coffin. So what they do is they made this indentation and they pour lead into it and it cool off and seal it. So pretty ingenious. They don't want people, you know, fiddling around with their coffins and the contents of them. But this is a Phoenician coffin. So there's clear evidence of the Phoenicians living on the island. For instance, here, this is a tiny hollow amulet dated to about the 7th to 6th century BC. That's it here. Now, I had to zoom up with that, so you can tell it's a little bit fuzzy, but it's very small. It's only about that big. It's tiny. But this has the head of the Egyptian god Horus, and it was found at what would have been the Phoenician capital of Rabat on the island. So remember I said the old capital of Malta was Mdina or Rabat, and then it moved to Valletta later on. This is a little Egyptian influenced hollow container. And when they opened it up, it contained this little bit of papyrus. And it had a prayer on it, directed against evil spirits in the afterlife. So apparently this was probably given to someone who was buried, and the papyrus prayer was meant to protect them from any demons or spirits who might try to hassle them in death. They also found, and you can't really see it here, but you know, if you look online, you can find it. There's actually a depiction on it of the goddess Isis on the fragment. Now, why are there two Egyptian, one Egyptian god, one Egyptian goddess? Well, the Phoenicians were trading with the Mediterranean. So the interchange of different gods and goddesses was common. In fact, if you look at it, really, all ancient gods and goddesses can be found all across the ancient Mediterranean. They just have different names. They may look different, but they're very much the same. They do the same sort of thing. So if you were a Phoenician, you'd go down to Egypt and you say, oh, well, our God does this. That God you have does that. Oh, they must be the same. You just call them a different name and they look different. And that's how it works all across the ancient Mediterranean. In fact, on the papyrus, it says, laugh, O strong of heart, at your enemy, make fun of, weaken, and attack the adversary, despise him, crush him over the waters, bring him down over the sea, tie him, hang him. So, no beating around the bush here. You naughty demons, do as you're told, or whoop you. Yeah, so you can see the point here. This is for protection in the afterlife. However, so the Phoenicians inhabited the island. But with the decline of the Phoenician cities like Tyre and Zidon in the east, of course, specifically in the 6th century with the capture of these islands by, say, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, and then, of course, the land being controlled by the Persians later on, cities like Tyre and Zidon still existed, but they weren't as powerful because they were under the thumb of, say, Babylon or the Persians. So they lost a lot of their influence. Now, later on, Tyre would be destroyed by Alexander the Great, but then it would be rebuilt by the Greeks and was there during Paul's day. So, cities like Tyre and Zidon in the east declined. But the Phoenician colony of Carthage, modern-day capital of Tunis in the country of Tunisia, that's Carthage. That was a Phoenician colony. They became the major power in the Western Mediterranean around 500 BC. So in essence, when Tyre and Zidon went into decline and Phoenicia lost its independence and some of its power, Carthage, in essence, took over the position. So these are still, you could say, Phoenicians, but modern historians would call them Carthaginians or the Punic culture. So they were Punic. So they're just different ways of naming the same thing. So Carthage. Now, of course, Carthage is most famous for its 3 wars that it fought against Rome, which ultimately resulted in Carthage being destroyed by Rome in 146 BC, which was the same year that Corinth was destroyed by the Romans in 146 BC. So the Romans were very busy in 146 BC, destroying major capitals of the Mediterranean world. And in 1 year, they basically controlled the Western Mediterranean beyond dispute. Now, Malta fell under Punic control or influence, but apparently, now we can't be too sure of this, they may have been given some degree of independence. So yes, they were under the control of Carthage, but Carthage was most interested in making money and doing business. And it's possible that they just made a deal and says, look, you help us, we help you. Because Carthage was most interested in making money, doing business. And Malta, of course, being situated in the middle of the Mediterranean, it's a very strategically important location for trade, but also for the military and for sailing. That's why, of course, during the Second World War, that the Germans and the Italians tried to conquer Malta because It's an unsinkable British aircraft carrier in the middle of the Mediterranean. And that's why they had to hold out. So, now, like I said, we're not going to go into detail, but just to understand, it's gone from prehistoric, then, of course, to Phoenician, to Carthaginian. What relates mostly to the biblical account of Malta is the Roman control of Malta. So during the Second Punic War, the inhabitants of Malta surrendered to the Romans, led by Sempronius Longus, in 218 BC. So apparently the Romans just show up on Malta and the Maltese just say, right, okay, we can't fight you. And so they just hand over control. Now, it became a part of the Roman province of Sicily because Malta is far too small to be its own province. So it just got bundled in with Sicily for obvious reasons. So it never had, you could say, a governor. But we're going to see it did have local leadership. So other places like the Roman province of Asia had a governor. Malta fell under the control of the Roman governor of Sicily and would remain under Roman control for several centuries after the 1st century AD. Then it became a part of the Byzantine Empire. Then it was conquered by the Arabs. And then, of course, we see the Crusader period, and it becomes the headquarters for the Order of St. John or the Knights Hospitaller during the times of the Crusades, and remained so for centuries. So, Roman control. Now, even though Malta, which is named in Latin Melita, so this is where we start getting to the biblical relevance of Malta, and compared to other places, Malta is only briefly mentioned in the scripture. Why? Because Paul was shipwrecked there. So, like, it would be great if the Bible was an inspired geography and history book that told us everything and anything about what happened, but that's not the point. It just mentions Malta because Malta was where Paul was shipwrecked, and Luke wrote about it because that's what happened, and of course he was there too. So it was called Melita. Now there's some debate as to what does the name mean. Some people think it means it comes from the Phoenician word for refuge or safety, and Malta was a refuge for ships. You know, where was Paul shipwrecked on Malta, and where was Alexandrian grain ships doing that took Paul rest away to Italy? They were refuge in there. Some people think it refers to honey or sweetness, because on the island there are apiaries, you know, where they had ancient beekeeping. So there's some debate, but you can see where the modern name comes from. Melita, Malta. Now, even though Malta had been long under Roman control by the time that the Apostle Paul was shipwrecked here in 60 AD, the Punic culture was still apparently very strong. How do we know that? Well, as Luke calls the people of the island barbarous. Now, that's not intended as an insult. What does barbarous mean in the 1st century AD? Basically, to be called a barbarian was a reference to the language of a people. So the term Greek, the word we get for barbarian, comes from Greek, which what it means is the people who go ba 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 ba. What's that mean? Well, the Greeks, when they were listening to other people and their language, to their ear, it sounded like ba 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 ba. So they're barbarians, the people who go ba 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 ba. So it's referencing someone who doesn't speak that language. And by the 1st century, the two main languages of the Mediterranean were Greek and Latin. Latin was the official language of the Roman government. Greek was the language, common language for commerce. And so when Paul and Luke are shipwrecked there, Malta, even though it's been controlled by the Romans, it had its own distinct culture, its own distinct language. Because, you know, the Roman Empire, yes, Latin was spoken, Greek was spoken. In fact, Greek was probably more spoken than Latin was. But, you know, do you think the common languages of the people were wiped out? No. They kept speaking their own language. You see examples of that. The Romans weren't interested in getting everyone to speak Latin or Greek. As long as they paid their taxes and were obedient, that's all they cared about. You worship what God you want, you do what you want, how you want, as long as you just are good citizens, that's all. And so the term barbarous, I don't think is an insult. He's just saying, look, when we landed there, these people did not speak either Greek or Latin, though the language would have been similar to Hebrew. It would have been similar. And so maybe what happened is if people didn't speak Greek or Hebrew when they first met them, because obviously later on they meet Publius, who's obviously been influenced by the Romans, Paul may have been able to speak to them because he may have been able to understand them and talk to them. Now, we don't know all the details, but obviously they were speaking a language that was not common. And like I said, you go to Malta today, Maltese is not a common language, is it? So we could say, well, not to insult the Maltese, are very nice people, that they are to us are barbarous people. It's not an insult, it's just sort of a way of stating they talk funny. So anyone who talks funny to you and you can't understand what they're saying, you could say barbarous. It doesn't mean they go around and, it's go around with spears and loincloths and, that's not what it means. See, we get words and we take them and we add meaning onto them that wasn't originally intended. They probably spoke a dialect of Punic or Carthaginian or Phoenician, maybe a mix, because there was Greek influence, there was Latin influence, there was Carthaginian influence. There was probably also influence from their prehistory to make this lovely language. That to Luke's ear is like, what? But they were nice. In fact, Paul, what does Luke say? He said they were very hospitable and kind. So I don't think he's trying to insult anyone. He's just saying, look, they spoke funny compared to what I'm used to or what we're used to, which is the same today. And so, where did that come from? Because they were a Phoenician influence, Punic influence culture. That's why Luke says that. It wasn't common. And he probably would have said the same thing if he went to North Africa, where they would have spoke similar. So if you learn something, there you go. Why does Luke say that? Well, because of all this history, stuff went before. In fact, here, this is a bilingual inscription found at Lectus Magna in what is Libya in northern Africa, which was part of Carthage and their empire. But of course, it was taken over by the Romans. But you notice here, you can see a very clear Latin inscription. But you notice this? That's Punic. So you can see even there, they were the official language, but they would have spoken Punic. So it's possible that this is what some Luke or Paul would have seen when they went to Malta. We don't know all the details. So tradition teaches, though, that the site of the famous shipwreck recorded in Acts 27 was located on a small island off the northeast of the island of Malta at the entrance of a large bay. The bay is now called St. Paul's Bay for obvious reasons. Now, there is no good reason, biblical or otherwise, to dismiss this identification, though there are other bays that may have been the site of the event. So you can see here, he landed on Malta. Of course, he was in the storm on this grain ship that was going to Rome. They were on the storms for 2 weeks, 14 days when he got to Malta. So they were being pushed from the east to the west. So logically, the bay had to be on the east coast of Malta because Gozo had its own name in the 1st century. Malta or Melite. So you see here, there's several examples. Valletta, of course. There's St. George's Bay. There's smaller ones. But this is believed by tradition to be the site of St. Paul's shipwreck. So St. Paul's Bay. So right next to where I was staying when I was staying on the island. Now there. Now could it be another? Well, of course it could. But it does seem to fit the description that Luke gives. So like I say, tradition isn't always bad. If tradition doesn't contradict what the Bible says, well then it's all right. But you take it with a pinch of salt. Could have been somewhere else. We don't know. So here's just a map of the shipwreck. period. So look, Paul's been taken to Rome. Now it's nice that they sort of do that. He's probably so, and also just a point here, when the Bible mentions that they were in the Adriatic Sea, of course, today we call that the Adriatic. We just say that's the Adriatic. In fact, but this area of the sea was also called the Adriatic in the 1st century. It was only in later period that this became the Adriatic. You know, names change, you know, and in fact, you know, the sea doesn't have a nice little line through it saying, oh, this is where one sea begins and one sea ends. You know, that's not how it works. But they go from Crete, 14 days on the sea in a storm, and are shipwrecked on Malta. So there. So North Africa, Sicily. Now, this is an aerial view of where St. Paul's Bay is. So there is the Bay of St. Paul. Now, there's a little island here. That is believed to be the specific place, according to tradition, where the ship was wrecked. Now, of course, the Bible tells us that when the ship was wrecked, everyone just jumped overboard and grabbed the first thing they could and got paddled to the coast, and they all survived. So it also says that this happened where two seas meet, which some people would interpret saying, in fact, there is an area here where there's a small channel where the north meets the south. So somewhere here, you know, at the end of the day, we don't always know exactly what's is being referred to. They did, we don't. We just have to try to figure it out. But St. Paul's Bay. Now, here's the island. And you can see it's only a small place. So apparently the ship struck ground there. People jumped overboard, paddled to safety wherever they could. But tradition teaches that this is where the ship was wrecked. Now, later on, being a site where tradition teaches something happened, they couldn't stick a church there for obvious reasons. They probably would have if they could have, but there's a statue there. So does that mean that's the place dogmatically? No, but there's no reason to dismiss it just because it's a traditional site. Like I said, be careful. Some traditional sites are not, they're wrong. Some could be. And I don't see any reason why to dismiss this out of hand. You know, we got to be careful. You know, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater just because some traditions are wrong and because some of them can be right. They're closer to the events that we are. We just have to be careful. But here, so there is the island. You see the statue on the top. So this is, of course, close to where the event took place, apparently. You can see that, all that blue ocean. It makes you want to go and travel. Ooh, look. And it was nice and sunny, and I took a walk around there. Very nice place to go and see. This is St. Paul's Bay. Now, the modern city of St. Paul's Bay is across there. It's the bay and the name of a city. So down there is where the head of the bay is. This is looking out. So the island is over there. The modern city is over there. So, you know, this is what is traditionally known as St. Paul's Bay. Now, after the shipwreck, Acts 28 verses 7 to 8 states that Paul was shown hospitality by a local man named Publius, which shows clear Latin influence. So there is probably a mishmash of different cultures on the island. Who Luke records was the chief man of the island, or another way of saying that is the first man. So if you're the chief, you're the first. You're the first person. You're the most important fellow. He was called the chief man of the island, and who lived near the site of the wreck. So his house, his villa, was apparently very close by, and he was a local leader. Remember who controlled the island? Rome did. It was under the governorship of the governor of Sicily. Paul also healed the man's fervor during the stay, and he healed other people. Now, the position of local leadership that Publius held, presumably under the Roman governor of Sicily, because you wouldn't have a governor for Malta. Why? It's too small. But you do need someone to head up things for the governor. And this position is confirmed by the existence of 3 inscriptions, 2 in Greek from the time of the Emperor Tiberius, so about 30 years before Paul's arrival on Malta. So 2 Greek inscriptions that mention the first man of the island of Malta. They call first, but chief first is interchangeable. They're synonymous. And a Latin inscription dated to either the 1st or 2nd century AD, which also mentions there was a chief man of the island of Malta. Now, how powerful was this individual? Probably relatively powerful. You know, after a point, it appears that the island became more integrated into the Roman Empire and became more Roman. But this position carried on and was well in existence in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. So obviously, this was one of the right-hand men of the Roman governor in Sicily. Publius was him. So now we don't have any pictures because getting those inscriptions and that, you know, and they look all the same anyway, you know. So they're out there. You can check. In fact, you see here, this is one reference. You can go into a big book and it's full of German. You can see the text. So they're out there, just to let you know. I do try to find pictures to show these things, but if you want to go and look for this online, go ahead. It is there. So now, later local tradition declares that the site of a church building, now, which is dated to the 14th century AD, that's where you start to have issues. The further away from the time, the tradition gets more dodgy. However, the site of a church building near St. Paul's Bay named San Paul Milky, which means sort of St. Paul is welcomed or St. Paul healed. And of course, so you see this is, of course, you can tell this is Maltese for St. Paul Milky. So even they can't agree, is it welcomed or is it so on? Is believed to be the site of Publius's villa. Now, there's a difference between a villa. A villa was a Roman country residence. A domus was an urban residence. So a domus is a city or town habitation. A villa is the country. Now, excavations at the site of the church, this is it there, have unearthed a Roman villa, though whether this is the actual location of Publius's villa or not cannot be proven, though it is possible. We just don't know. You know, this is a bit more skeptical. It's 14th century, earliest we know. So, you know, you take this with a big heap and pinch of salt, but maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So you see here, this is what's left. You can't actually visit the site because it's closed off. It's only open one day of a year for a specific religious festival. The rest of it is being excavated. And so you can't get into it. So this is other people's pictures. St. Paul's Bay is over there. So it is relatively close. That's why, you know, probably they thought, oh, look, here's a Roman house. St. Paul was shipwrecked there. Big Roman house. Publius. This must be the place. So you can see there's a logic there. Now, could it have been somewhere else? Of course. But maybe it is. Maybe it isn't, you know. Ultimately, our faith isn't based on buildings. It's based on what the Bible says. Could it be somewhere else? Yeah. I believe it took place somewhere. Is this Publius's villa? What's left of it? Possible. So it just gives you more of an idea of what Malta is like. But that's it. So like I said, biblically speaking, Malta is a very minor place in the Bible. Basically just a bit of one chapter and a bit of another chapter at the end of Acts. That's it. Why is it mentioned? Well, because Paul was shipwrecked there. That's the reason why God mentions it. But however, in conclusion, we have taken just a brief look at the geographical, historical, and archaeological context of Malta during the time of the Bible, both before and during Paul's unexpected and brief visit to the island. And you know, if there's only one thing you learn from this is why were the people of the island called barbarous? Was it Luke being insulting? No, they spoke a different language, Punic. Why? Because it was controlled by Carthage and controlled by the Phoenicians before Rome took it over. But yet Publius is a very clear, common Roman name. So, you know, that's the only thing you take away from it, fine. Now, you can say, well, I don't think that's St. Paul's Bay. Well, fine. I don't think that's Publius's villa. Fine. But the fact is, we have seen here that there's good reason, I believe, to see the accuracy of Luke's statement. He knew these people were different. And so I think we can hopefully have learned something from this. Malta is a very lovely place. If you can go, you should go. You can see the lovely blue ocean and blue sky, and it's different to here in Ireland. But yeah, I enjoyed it. And I hopefully you've learned something a little bit about the island and what was going on there. So we're going to finish there.